So with that, I'll turn the floor over now to Catherine Mann for the presentation of the economic outlook. Thank you. Catherine?
Thank you very much. This is an outlook that has both positive and negative attributes to it. The negative attributes are that the global economy has been growing significantly slower than we would hope for. The positive attributes is that we can chart a path for policymakers to achieve a better outcome, one that keeps promises that we've made to our citizens. So I'd like to go through this in terms of a diagnosis of the low growth trap, the consequences, and then address policy recommendations. So that's the order of business. The global economy is stuck in a low-growth trap. We're going to talk about that in the context of advanced economies, emerging markets, look at weak trade and investment issues, continuing on with some themes that we had from last year and the last economic outlook in the interim in February, and then address some of the risks, of course, including Brexit. One of the consequences of this low-growth trap, or one of the associated elements, is that we have a situation where productivity growth has slowed and inequality has risen. And the second chapter in the economic outlook delves into this twin challenge in more depth. And of course, you know that this twin challenge is also the nexus of the MCM for this year for the OECD. We're going to conclude with looking at the comprehensive and collective action that policymakers can undertake in order to keep the promises that they have given their citizens, the young, the old, the investors, and those in the middle income group as well. So let's look at where we are in terms of global GDP. As you can see, with the red line, on average, what the cruising speed of the global economy is at about 4%. But what we've seen over the last 5 years, and including into our forecast, is that the global economy is not going to attain that rate of growth. For next year, we're looking at 3% for the completion of this year at 3%, which is exactly the same as we were for last year, and then going on to 2017, an increase to 3.3. So basically, we're looking at pretty much a flatline growth for the overall global economy. If you look at the blue line, which is the OECD economies, basically not really achieving even 2%. Over the forecast period. This rate of growth is insufficient in order to make good on promises, and we'll talk a lot more about what we mean about those promises. Now, for the non-OECD countries in green, there is a bit of an improvement over the forecast horizon. But I think one of the things that we ought to remember when we look at the green line is that back in 2011, where GDP growth was at 7%, about 7%, that meant that incomes would double in 10 years. Whereas where it is now, which is just a little bit over 4%, it means it takes almost 20 years in order for income to double. And for the emerging markets, that difference is truly dramatic. We can look at individual countries within this by looking at the projections below, but I think I will leave that for specific questions. Now, what are the underpinnings of this low growth trap, and why do we want to call it a trap? So the first issue is that investment has continued to be weak. I'll show some data for the two large players in the global economy, China and the U.S., in just a minute. But continuing on, as I said, from our February outlook and indeed from last June, the investment profile for virtually all countries in the global economy has continued to remain very weak. A little bit of an uptick, but not really very much. With these kinds of slow investment rates, that means that trade also has been dramatically weaker than we would have expected in a normal recovery. Just to give you an idea, we can look at the Euro area and the United States. Look at the green bar. In the early part of this recovery, Europe was the reason why global trade was growing so slowly. But now, looking at the red bar, you can see that the global trade weakness is centered on Asia, with the decline in the rates of growth across the board ending up with a total stepping down from blue to green to red in the global economy on the far right set of bars, that this represents a significant deterioration in trade growth. On average, looking at the global economy and the world trade set of bars, about 7% rate of growth of trade. That would have been associated with much higher rates of growth of investment, much higher rates of growth of productivity. So the fact that we have had such this decline in global trade growth implies that it is also a slow productivity growth. It's a circle: slow investment, low trade growth, low productivity growth. So looking now at the two major players in the global economy, on the China being, of course, an important global player in terms of its contribution to global growth, and particularly to the investment part of global growth and the trade part of global growth. The right-hand panel gives you an idea of how much rebalancing is underway in China. The black line is the GDP growth, which we're expecting to drift down to 6.2 by 2017. And you can see that the gap widening up between the rate of growth of manufacturing in the red line, still positive, but dramatically declined, and the rate of growth of services in the blue line, also rising initially, but more recently taking a downturn, giving us pause about the extent to which rebalancing has actually continued to take place in China. Now, a second reason for why China's rebalancing is important to global trade and to global investment is that they are in the process of moving onshore products that used to be sourced through a global value chain. And the right-hand panel, declining rate of share of China's processing trade in both the exports and imports. You can see the decline in the share over the time period 25 through the most current data. What this means is that countries that used to depend on being part of China's global value chain no longer have that ability, and they have to either look for other global value chains to join or turn to domestic demand as a source of growth. And that's the centerpiece of the slowdown in global trade in the Asia region. Now, looking at the other major player in the global economy, we'll be looking at Europe in a little bit. Weak exports and investment are weighing on U.S. growth. This decomposition of GDP growth rates, where GDP growth rates is in the black line, you can see the importance of consumption, and that has been robust in the United States, although not as much as we would have expected, again, in a period of time where growth should be faster than what we're observing. The notable feature of the last two quarters, Q4 in 2015 and Q1 in 2016, is the absence of a blue component on that chart. What that says is that investment has played no role in supporting growth in the United States. And that has implications not only for trade, because investment is very trade intensive, very global value chain intensive, but it also means that investment and capital stock being a key element in the underpinnings of potential growth in an economy, this undermines the capacity of the U.S. to grow in the long run. So zero contribution of investment to U.S. growth rate not only is a concern in the near term for sources of demand, sources of job creation and wages, but also concerns about longer-term capacity in the United States. Now, an implication of these slow growth, trade, investment, is that there's slow contribution of those to labor market improvement. Now, it's true that labor markets are in better shape than they were in many economies, but not all. And you can see on the left-hand side the unemployment rate, where it was in 2006. So this is before the true crisis. So it's not the peak. And we can look at the unemployment rate now, And for many of the economies, most of these shown here are the European economies. The green bar being higher means that unemployment has not yet reached where it was. The labor markets have not healed to the extent that they were back in 2006. Now, if we look at people who are actually employed, the employment rate, which is on the right-hand panel, you can see that there has been an improvement in Japan, and we're forecasting an additional improvement in Japan as more people are brought into the labor market. We're forecasting an improvement in the United States, but look at how much lower the employment rate of the working age population is in the United States compared to where it was in 2000. This, of course, it comes from the lower labor force participation rate in the United States, as well as some demographics. For Europe, the employment rate projected for over the forecast period only barely gets us back to where we were in 2008. So good news and bad news on the labor markets. Bottom line, healing only very slowly. And if we look at the end of the forecast horizon, we still see 6.5 million people unemployed compared to where we were in the labor market prior to the crisis beginning. So when we think about a trap, that we have low investment, low trade, therefore lower than expected employment rates, not as much wage generation as we would have expected, meaning not insufficient aggregate demand, that circles around, and we have no incentive for business to invest. The implication is that there are not in place the market forces that would allow us to get out of the equilibrium that we are at with global growth rates at 3% for this year and 3.3% for next year. Not only are we stuck in this trap with market forces making it challenging to get us out, but there are also significant risks to the downside. For emerging markets, we have both internal and external risks coming through financial market channels, having to do with the currency composition of debt on the external side, which you can see in the left panel, as well financial market risks coming through high domestic debt, which you can see in the right-hand panel. Now, some countries are exposed both on the internal side and on the external side, and countries that come to mind, for example, for their external exposure is Turkey. We can also see on the internal side the increase in debt exposure to corporations. We can look at a country like South Africa, which has substantial debt exposure on the external side, but has not worsened its position on the internal side. And then we can look at, for example, a country like Russia, which is in a similar position to Turkey. If we just look at countries that have exposure on the internal side, the countries that come to mind, of course, is China. So different groups, depending on whether the potential shocks come from the exchange rate, in which case the left-hand panel is more relevant, or whether the shocks come through monetary policy or other actions that are most pertain to the internal exposure, which would be the right-hand panel. More generally around the world, financial markets have been very volatile. And we can see that both in terms of where we are in equity markets on the left-hand panel, where only the United States has had an equity market recovery from the earlier volatile period in the middle of last year. Other markets have not yet recovered. On looking at the right-hand panel, across high risky or high risk asset classes, volatility has increased dramatically since 2011, 2012. Now, we're not exactly, in terms of these measures of risk and volatility, we're not exactly yet back to a Lehman moment in terms of the level of volatility or the degree of volatility. But we do have to worry about financial accidents in an environment where growth is low and stuck in a low growth trap. So we are monitoring these kinds of equity market issues and volatility in asset markets because since we have a low growth trap, the potential for tipping into a much deeper low growth situation increases with the degree of volatility in financial markets. Now, of course, a risk that has salience right now in the near term is, of course, Brexit. Brexit would impose costs on the UK, Europe, and the global economies. Looking, and you know, of course, we have an extended study on the various, much more detailed analysis on the source of the data or the scenarios that you see here. And if you need references to that, you can either look below in your handout or go to the OECD website. When we think about the long-term effects of Brexit on the UK, we've done an exercise that looks at a whole range of channels through which Brexit could affect the UK economy to a 2030 time period. And you can see we have an optimistic and a central and a pessimistic scenario. The central scenario is that by 2030, Brexit would cost the UK economy about 5% of GDP. Now, the channels through which that happens is in the near term, we'd be looking at basically financial market channels and their implication through consumer confidence and consumer spending. Those are near-term channels. In the longer term, we start to see the costs of breaking off trade relationships as having costs not just through trade itself, but also through the productivity consequences of reduced foreign direct investment, the productivity consequences of lower skill accumulation, both through management, through foreign direct investment, but also skills in terms of lower migration and in terms of productivity consequences through continuing lower churn in the labor markets and in the financial markets. Now, in the short term, what we're looking at is not just the consequences for the UK. Now, this is the right-hand panel, and we're looking at it through 2018, where, again, the financial market channels are the principal ones that we are estimating in this particular exercise. We can see that the UK cost of Brexit in the short term for the UK is a drop of 1.25% or so on GDP by 2018. And you can see that the spillovers to other economies can be significant. The Irish economy, because it has both tight trade relations as well as tight financial connections, we view this as having a high exposure to the Brexit vote. They also could lose more than 1 percentage point of GDP. For the euro area, some countries in the euro area have very tight connections. For example, the Netherlands, and some have somewhat looser connections, again, channels both through trade linkages as well as financial linkages. Some of the medium ones would be France, for example, and Germany, and Denmark and Belgium and Austria. But we put those all together in terms of the euro area. Short-term impact of Brexit on the euro area is a cost of more than 1% of GDP. Widening out the scope of the potential consequences to the OECD, more than 0.5 percentage point. To the BRICS, who would experience volatility in the shocks coming through the financial markets, again, more than 0.5 percentage point of GDP. Japan and the U.S. somewhat less, but still noticeable in terms of consequences for those economies of a Brexit leave vote. So when we think about Brexit, we think about it in the context of the global economy and the risk that it poses to a global economy that is already growing only at about 3%. So we've got this low growth trap where market forces are very muted in order to get us out of that trap. We have a set of financial risks facing both advanced and emerging markets. So what are some of the consequences of that low growth trap, and what could we do about it? So one consequence is slowing productivity growth, and another one is rising inequality. So we can look at the declining productivity growth, and we can see over different time periods, the 90s up to the present in the set of three stacked bars, that labor productivity growth, which is an essential underpinning of economies to be able to grow in the longer term and also to make good on improvements in per capita income, that has declined dramatically for all of the advanced economies, which you can see different breakouts there in the left-hand panel. You can see how large the decline is for the euro area, a drop from 2 down to less than a percentage point growth in labor productivity. And over in the right-hand panel, a set of the emerging markets, and you can see, except for India, and the special case of Brazil, because of course they've gone into recession, labor productivity growth also declining for those economies. Now, we've been doing a lot of research on the sources of the declining labor productivity growth, and again, I point you to the second chapter in the Economic Outlook, which goes through some of the most recent research. But let me show you one of the key elements of why labor productivity has declined by looking at firm-level data. Now, you know that there are these two ways of thinking about labor productivity growth. There's Bob Gordon, who sort of says all the good innovations have been invented, and so we have to be stuck with low productivity growth going forward. And then you have Joel Mokyr and Eric Brynjolfsson and McAfee, who basically say there's plenty of innovation going on. How can they both be right? This chart gives you insights into how they can both be right. The top two lines are two different ways of measuring the most productive firms in the global economy. The red line is the top 5%. These are in each sector, the most innovative firms around the globe. And you can see that they continue to increase their productivity over the sample period that goes from 2000 up almost to the present, to 2014. The top 100 firms, widening out the scope a little bit in terms of the most productive firms in the global economy, still doing very well, although the widening gap in the last couple of years between the tippy top and the ones who are very productive, that gives us a lot of concern. But look at the gap between the ones who are most productive up at the top and the rest of the firms, which is the green line. Those firms have had virtually no increase in their productivity growth over this entire period. So when Bob Gordon says there's no productivity growth, he's talking about the green line. When Brynjolfsson, Joel Mokyr, and McAfee talk about lots of productivity, they're talking about the top two lines. What's the difference between these? Go read the chapter for some of the research, but it is tied into investment, lack of aggregate demand, and a range of policies that stand in the way of entry and exit of firms and the reallocation of both labor and capital in economies. Now, not only is there a problem with low productivity growth, there is also a problem with regard to the return to labor and rising inequality. On the left-hand panel, we can look at one source of inequality, and that is that wages, which is in the green bar, for almost every economy is growing less than is labor productivity growth. We would expect wages and labor productivity growth to be much more tightly related. And when we look at this chart, especially for the OECD, where you can see it in the red, there's a big gap between the labor productivity growth and median labor income. This is the declining labor share that many people talk about. Another source of inequality comes from the labor income itself. And on the right-hand panel, you can see the evolution of inequality in income, looking at the mean income, which is in the middle, in the blue line, then looking at the top 10% in the red line, and then the bottom 10% in the green line. So we're looking at a widening gap between the red line and the green line, widening gap between the income, disposable income, accruing to the top 10% and the bottom 10%. We also see a stagnation in the average income. That's the blue line kind of being flat. So after rising since 1990 to 2007, after rising, now stagnant since post-financial crisis. And then lastly, looking at the deterioration in household disposable income in real terms for the bottom 10%. So there's inequality with regard to the distribution, inequality in terms of the return to labor, as well as stagnation in the middle and deterioration at the bottom 10. So lots of different types of inequality. And again, looking at the second chapter in the Economic Outlook will give you insights into the work that we have underway to explain why those gaps in inequality occur and are rising. Now, we're also looking at the way they are related. And of course, the word that is, the word of the MCM is the productivity and inequality nexus. How are productivity and inequality related? This diagram shows you that they are indeed related. The bottom gives you what is true about the distribution between the most productive firms and the least productive in each country. So it's that looking at that first chart, looking at each country, the distribution of productivity across firms. And then we look at the inequality and the distribution across wages, the chart I just showed you, for each economy. And you can see the nice correlation between inequality at the firm level for productivity and inequality in wages across those same firms. So we have a low growth trap, that's our diagnosis. We have consequences of low productivity, low equity. And so what do we do to improve on it? And let's take one more look at what the nexus of low productivity and high inequality and low growth mean. What they mean, the low growth trap, means that we cannot make good on our promises that we've given to our citizens. We promise our young people that they will have a job after they get educated, they will have a career path, and what we're seeing in this chart is that, in fact, we are failing on that promise. Looking at the right-hand panel, you can see that from 2007 to where we are today, the percentage employment rate for youth has actually gone down by about 2.5 percentage points. So there are fewer youth being employed now than there was at the height of the boom. In addition, we can look at the inactive and unemployed youth, the ones who are not in education or training and are completely disconnected from the labor force, and that's on the left-hand panel, about 15% in the OECD as a whole and much larger for other countries. We know from our research that the first 10 years of a young person's career is fundamental in terms of their lifetime earnings. So these youth, this generation of youth, has permanently scarred capacity to earn in the longer run. So we've broken promises to the youth already. But we're also breaking our promises to the older people. We are not at a low growth rate of 3%, 2% in the advanced economies, 4% in the emerging markets. We are not going to be able to make good on our promises to the old people that we will pay their pensions and their health care. This shows you a scenario, a simulation, looking at an individual who retires after 40 years. He saves for 40 years. And back in 2000, we're indexing it to how good would their retirement income be in 2000. And then we play forward and say, well, what happens to a person who is retiring now and had the same kind of retiring profile in their portfolio. And so somebody who retires now versus somebody who retired in 2000, basically half of the value of their retirement savings that they need, that they will have in their portfolio to move forward into their retirement years. So we've definitely broken our promises to the old people too, by being stuck in the low growth trap. So what can we do with monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural policy, the three-legged stool that I've talked about before? Well, most people know that the monetary policy authorities have been working extremely hard and virtually alone in order to try to raise economic activity and inflation according to their mandates. So they've pursued negative interest rates in a number of cases, as you can see on the left-hand panel, and of course they've expanded balance sheets, which you can see on the right-hand panel. But there are concerns that we have about monetary policy working alone. First, we're concerned that some central banks become dominant holders of government bonds, and you can see, for example, in the UK and Britain, those are, more than a third of government bonds are owned by the government. Even in the United States, it's more than 20%. There are some concerns over liquidity. There are concerns about the exposure of the central bank balance sheet to the time when interest rates actually do rise. We are a little bit concerned about the intersection and the feedback loops between debt managers, the ones who issue the debt, and monetary policy authorities. Some independence there could potentially come under of a concern. In addition, this very long period of low interest rates as well as negative interest rates, along with the slow growth in general, is damaging the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, which is, of course, banks. And you can look at that in terms of the right-hand panel, falling bank share prices. Now, there are a number of factors going on: low growth, monetary policy, regulatory environment. But again, the transmission mechanism of monetary policy is through banks, and when they are in distressed terms, which is suggested by the falling bank share prices, that this is something that makes it more difficult for monetary policy to work, and it shows the challenges of monetary policy working alone. Now, the case is that monetary policy has given us an environment for fiscal authorities to have more space. Now, what do we mean about space? It means that fiscal authorities have the opportunity to borrow at very low interest rates, in some cases negative interest rates. Looking at the middle panel, for example, in the euro area, compared to 2010, the dotted line, the three-year horizon, the euro area, can borrow in negative terms. So these very low interest rates create fiscal space and create an environment where fiscal policy can take action. What would be the implications of fiscal policy undertaking a more aggressive stance? We've done an exercise looking at 0.5 percentage point of GDP public investment. That could be undertaken with this umbrella of much lower interest rates, and it leads to, in the case of undertaking public investment, in particular hard, in some countries, transportation, fiber optics, soft in other countries having to do with education and innovation, undertaking those projects that have high rates of return does more to promote growth, catalyze business investment, which of course we know has been slack, catalyzing business investment. Both of those improve the denominator, GDP, sufficiently to create fiscal sustainability, which you can see on the right-hand panel. Debt to GDP, in fact, goes down from having fiscal expansion within the context of the additional fiscal space provided by the low interest rate environment of monetary policy. Now, of course, the third leg of the stool, monetary, fiscal, and structural, is and has always been crucial to the effectiveness of either of the demand management tools. We've seen that the pace of structural reform has slowed. This is our going for growth publication that was launched in February of this year in Shanghai. And you can see that in comparison to more robust efforts in the intermediary period in the 2000s, in 2011, 2014, 2015 has been a very slow period for undertaking the reforms that are needed in order to make the monetary policy and make fiscal policy effective. Now, each country has different things that it needs to examine, but we think about policy coherence as being looking at the composition of public spending, looking at the left, the degree of market competition associated with firm entry and investment in services, looking at the degree of labor market mobility, geography and job mobility, looking at packages of improvements to labor markets as well as product market reforms, and then leaving as well to look at the function of the financial system, the degree of non-performing loans, how much new credit is being accessed. So each country has to look at its own homework with regard to financial market policies, labor market policies, product market policies. That's the coherence within the structural policy settings that is crucial. So if we summarize our economic outlook, our diagnosis is that we're in a low growth trap. Market forces are not going to get us out of it. We have subdued investment, trade, employment, wages, productivity growth. It's a trap in that it is self-fulfilling. The risks are substantial on the downside. We've got Brexit, very salient in the near term, emerging market financial vulnerabilities on both the internal and the external side, putting them at risk, and then increased financial market volatility, which impacts all markets around the world. The consequences of the trap and the risks is that we've broken our promises to the young, the old, and the investors. We've broken those promises because we cannot get productivity rising. We cannot improve our low growth prospects, and there's rising inequality. The recommendations come for a comprehensive, meaning fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural policy, comprehensive, coherent. Within the structural area, we have to be coherent across labor, finance, and competition. And then if all policymakers were to undertake these pathways to the higher growth path together, then each one would not have to do quite so much. So recommendation, comprehensive, coherent, and collective action by policymakers brings us to a higher growth path that allows us to keep the promises that we've made to our citizens. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much for that presentation. We're going to go straight into questions now. You should all, just to mention right before the questions, have all the materials. We'll give you the full outlook in paper or in PDF as you like. Please.
Larry Elliott of The Guardian in London. The global economy is facing lots of risks, so hard landing in China, emerging market financial crisis. How would you rate Brexit amongst those? Quantify it. Is Brexit a bigger threat than a hard landing in China or an emerging market crisis? How do you rank it amongst the many risks that the global economy is facing and has faced in recent years?
So the issue about the hard landing in China has been with us quite a while, actually. If you can recall back to our economic outlook last year, we did an exercise on the consequences for the global economy of a hard landing in China. And I would have to say that the quantitative estimates are in the same ballpark as Brexit. Now, the concerns are that, of course, Brexit is in the near term. It's very salient right now. The global economy needs to get on a higher growth path, and the more challenges and dips in the road that it faces, the more difficult it is to get into an environment where business confidence is sufficiently robust as to promote the type of self-fulfilling positive feedback loop where we have more investment, that creates more jobs, it supports higher wage growth, that generates more consumption, which then supports the aggregate demand that ratifies business investment. We need to get on a positive growth path, which means policymakers facing all of these risks down the pike have even more reason to work collectively to get us to the higher growth path.
Other questions here? Yeah, right there, microphone.
Yes, hello, Cyril Lachaise from L'Opinion. If we compare with what you said in January, on the short term, can we say that prospect has been better for the world growth? And what could be the good surprise in this environment?
So in the interim economic outlook that we issued in February, we have the same growth rate for the global economy for this year at 3%. That was a downgrade of 0.3 from November of last year. For 2017, again, 3.3 was where we were in February. Again, that was a downgrade from November. For individual economies, there's some up and some down based on incoming data. The difference that where we were in November compared to February and now, we did an evaluation of the way we were thinking about the underpinnings of our projections. And we evaluated, there's this cycle of forecast optimism followed by disappointment. And for the OECD forecasts, for the IMF forecasts, a number, I think it was in November 2 years ago, I had a chart that showed it was the swoopy chart where each, we had the optimistic, and then we would move forward to another forecast and we would be disappointed, but we would continue to be optimistic. So we reevaluated that process going into our February outlook. And what we did was we evaluated the relationship between tight labor markets and wage growth, because based on historical experience, we should be seeing much more wage growth already than we are. So we reevaluated those relationships and said, what's true? What's true is that the linkages between labor market tightness and wage growth is much looser now than it used to be. And in fact, in the economic outlook, the body of the general assessment, we have some deeper analysis of that. We also looked at the relationship between interest rates and investment. Again, it should be the case that low interest rates spur investment. Well, not the case. And so we looked at that in depth in the chapter last June and reevaluated our own forecasts in light of the last decade worth of economic relationships. A third one, depreciation and strength of exports. Again, we looked at that in February and said, not so strong as it used to be, so reevaluate our forecast on that basis. So on a number of these key relationships that underpin our forecast, we did a really deep sort of a reassessment going into our February forecast, and that's why we did the downgrades then. Coming in to where we are now, the world has not changed significantly. And that's, of course, the problem. We are so many months on, and there has been no change in the outlook.
Other questions? Maybe one right here, Rick.
Rick Mitchell, BNA. The trade data that came out yesterday had the U.S. exports down 3.8% for quarter one. Is there anything that's completely in U.S. hands that could improve that performance? A lot of it has been attributed to the decline in emerging economies. Is there anything the U.S. could do to improve exports? And the outlook mentions some structural policies that the U.S. could do, including antitrust changes. Could you give some details about what you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And also, it says that the fiscal outlook is neutral for the United States in terms of fiscal policy changes. How do you see the U.S. making investments in infrastructure, but also maintaining that neutral that neutral level of not increasing debt? Is there some trick to the investments that are needed in the United States that wouldn't increase the debt? Thank you.
So with regard to the the trade situation, effectively we're looking at, the U.S. is not immune to slowdowns in global trade growth around the world. And in some historical time period, the United States would have been a locomotive. More robust U.S. economy bolstering all other economies, and then the U.S. exports would rise following the locomotive. Well, that really isn't true anymore. And the U.S. economy can be robust, but still not act as a locomotive. We have, in addition, the issues with regard to the exchange value of the dollar, and we have issues with regard to the concentration of investment in mining, manufacturing. But the U.S. exports capital-intensive goods and services. It's a very large exporter of capital-intensive products. And so when investment is low around the world, U.S. exports are going to be damaged by that. So is there anything in the hands of the United States? Well, of course, from the standpoint of individual firms, who are the ones who are engaged here, improving competitiveness, improving productivity is the way that a firm increases its capacity to be competitive in the global marketplace. So segueing into your second question about structural issues that the U.S. economy needs to undertake, with particular reference to the antitrust, the U.S. survey will be launched in the U.S. At the Peterson Institute for International Economics on the 17th of June. And it does address the potential concerns that exist over the productivity consequences of concentrations of industry activity. There has been, through mergers and acquisitions, a concentration of firms, basically four-firm concentration ratios having gone up, as well as increased use of occupational licensing that tends to limit the mobility of workers. So we both have concerns about concentration in industry and the consequences for productivity growth that come from that. That's a negative. And we also are concerned about occupational licensing and the extent to which that limits the mobility of labor, and that also has negative consequences for productivity growth. So on the structural side, those are the two things in particular that we see as areas for policy action that would enhance the capacity of the economy to bolster productivity growth, and that would be associated with an improvement in competitiveness more generally.
Other questions? Angel, please.
Angel Calvo from the Spanish press news agency EFE. I will put my question in French. Sur les cas de l'Espagne, vous avez dit qu'il y a une marge pour une politique d'investissement public, qu'il y a de l'espace grâce à l'action de banques centrales. Alors, je voudrais savoir, dans les cas de l'Espagne, est-ce que vous pensez aussi qu'il y a de l'espace pour plus de dépenses publiques? Il y a maintenant des élections au mois de juin et tous les grands partis parlent de la question du marge fiscal. Certains les partis du gouvernement disent qu'ils voudraient baisser les impôts, par exemple, et d'autres voudraient modifier les engagements de l'Espagne avec l'Union européenne sur la réduction de déficit.
My French is boulangerie français, which means I can understand a fair amount. So this actually allows me to not only answer your question about Spain and the degree, this issue of fiscal space, but also to address the last question about U.S. fiscal space. So the issue here is that the key to debt sustainability is about the denominator, debt to GDP. GDP represents the capacity of the economy to make good on not just promises to the young and the old and everybody in the middle, but also to make good on promises to investors, meaning those who have bought sovereign debt. So the key to debt sustainability is not the numerator, it's the denominator. And so the strategy of engaging fiscal spending on high multiplier projects at a time when borrowing is extraordinarily cheap, that's what we mean by undertaking fiscal expansion at a time when interest rates are low, undertaking that to engage with the projects that have been put to the side for almost a decade, leading to erosion of the public capital stock. So it's true governments can't spend on anything, but we do have a menu that we've looked at based on our research, a menu of the types of projects and the types of investment by the public sector that enhance a capacity of the economy to grow, that catalyze business investment, and through those channels improve GDP. And if you improve GDP, then we can make good on our promises, including debt sustainability.
And in the report of Spain, there's some commentaries on the uncertainty because of the political situation. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this uncertainty and the consequences, for example, on investment and on confidence in general?
Well, in the Spanish survey, we talk about the key reforms that the next government has to undertake, and that would be true regardless of who is in power. So we're talking about looking at improving productivity, improving competitiveness, and improving job opportunities for the unemployed, facilitating their return to work. Now, regardless of who is put into power, the policy reforms that they have to undertake are the same.
Yeah. Good morning. Chiara Rancati from Italian Newswire ANSA. I will have one question on the situation of Italy. You said that the scarcity of bank credit is still slowing down the growth of investment. How much do you think this effect is important these days? And you said that the government has already been taking action on this. Do you think that more could be done, or it's just a question of time for this to be effective? Thank you.
It took a while for Italy's plan to clean up the balance sheets of the financial institutions to be fully formulated. But now that it is in place, or virtually in place, our expectation is that will create an environment that would support a return to credit extensions in Italy. That would be part of the strategy to improve economic performance more generally in Italy. It's part of that package. As I said, there are reforms on labor, reforms on competitiveness or competition policy, and reforms in the financial sector. All of them have to be packaged up together, and Italy does have a comprehensive package. We do know that credit in the euro area has been a problem and has been something that has negatively affected investment. A special chapter in the Economic Outlook last June goes into more detail on that, the relationship between credit availability and investment in the euro area.
Sure. One question right here. We're getting close to the end of the time. Just try to keep it short, and we'll do a couple more.
Yeah, just a question on Eurozone inflation.
Yeah.
There's expectations that when the ECB meets tomorrow that it won't downgrade its inflation projections for the first time in a while. Do you think that inflation in the Eurozone has bottomed out?
The numbers that just came out had a very, very large negative contribution coming from energy. And that has really been the challenge facing the ECB, is this wave of energy price declines pulling down the overall inflation rate. Based on that observation and the observation that energy prices appear to have stabilized, if not ticked up just a little bit, my view is that negative downdraft to inflation probably has subsided, and as a result, the downgrades to inflation probably have worked their way through completely.
One more question right over here.
Manon Malher, journalist for Le Figaro. On the fiscal spending, and especially in the Eurozone, so do you mean that Germany maybe has to do more on this side, and that this is necessary to improve growth in the Eurozone? Because this is a debate today. Thank you.
So Germany, of course, is undertaking fiscal expansion in the context of the very large refugee population that they have welcomed into their country, and that is an important contribution to the overall fiscal collective action that is a part of our recommendations. It is also the case that there are a range of other public investments that could be done in Germany because Germany, like other countries, put aside public investments for 7 or 8 years now since the financial crisis. Those investments were put to the side, and that's true for Germany as well as for other countries.
Time for one final question right there, and then we're going to have to call it.
Yes, excuse me. Hervé Days from Journal de la Marine Marchande. Just a question regarding trades. You spoke about the trades, and do you think sub-Saharan countries in Africa can play a new role tomorrow to be the locomotive for the trades, or are they so bad today that they can't be at the top in the next decades or next quarters?
Our projections go only through a 2-year horizon. And I believe over those 2-year horizon, the countries, the largest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, are going to continue to face the challenge of reorienting their economies away from natural resources, or balancing the natural resource abundance and their dependence on natural resource trade with a more broad-based and diversified trade profile and production profile domestically. As we can see from history of many other countries, making that transition away from or transition toward a more diversified trade platform and a more diversified domestic production platform is very challenging, and I would not expect that to happen in the next 2 years.
Catherine, thank you very much. Thanks all of you for participating in this briefing. I'd just like to mention we have copies of the Outlook, paper copies. If you're interested in speaking to specific economists about a given country, we do have, of course, desk economists on all the countries covered in the Outlook, so feel free to get in touch with the staff. And thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.